full time, I'm working on partnerships. I have the time and the space to plan and strategize and have those Zoom calls and so on and so forth. Whereas the state schools that we work with, the primary schools, they haven't got somebody who's allocated to it. Their job is teaching and marking and doing all of the things that teachers do. And so there does become this sort of natural situation where the independent school takes a lead. And that's because they've got that resource. In actual fact, it's the relationships between the two that matter. And it's the private school obviously is making those leaps and making those connections. But actually, once you've made those connections, you're right, that mutuality is everything. And so I quite often say, I do more work through WhatsApp than I do through email.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello, now I am delighted this week to be joined on the podcast by Graeme Lawrie MBE, who is the Partnerships Director at ACS International Schools. And Graeme and I are talking about how to create impactful partnerships between independent and state schools, with a view to delivering a vision to delivering excellent educational opportunities to as many young people as possible in our communities. And Graeme combines both passion and knowledge in this area, and I'm really pleased that he's joining me for this really important conversation about an area that's definitely a growth within the independent schools sector. Graeme is a qualified teacher and has been teaching for 22 years, specialising in technology, computing, electronics and design. He started his career at Oakham School and then moved on to Sevenoaks School in 2006. And there, whilst he was head of faculty for science, he developed the largest free science event in the UK at the time, a kind of turning point in his work around partnerships. Graeme joined ACS International Schools in 2019 as their Director of Partnerships. So ACS International Schools is comprised of 4 schools, 3 in Greater London and 1 in Doha in Qatar. Between them, they educate over 3,700 girls and boys, aged 2 to 18, within both a day and boarding environment. And the students there come from over 100 countries. Graeme was awarded an MBE in 2020 for his services to education, and he's also received a host of teaching awards during his career, including the Lloyds Trust Teacher of the Year Award in 2005, Pearson Teacher of the Year in 2012, and was named by TES as one of the top 5 UK science teachers in 2014. Graeme is passionate about social mobility and the increased social capacity through education. And he's worked with hundreds of schools, refugee camps and other charities over the last 10 years to give many opportunities to those in less fortunate circumstances. During our conversation, Graeme and I talk about the realities of creating an impactful partnerships programme with state schools. This isn't some sort of theoretical, high-level discussion. This is about how to actually, on the ground, make sure that your partnerships are truly mutually beneficial. How it's a really great idea that you're trying to form friendships, not just relationships. Focusing in on impact and understanding what that means and the role of data in understanding that impact. And also the strategic pillars of the work that he's doing with ACS. Before we dive into the detail, I wanted to let you know about a free resource I've created to help you prepare your school for the coming economic impact of the invasion of Ukraine. It's a checklist of things you need to think about and take action on now, and it's designed to prompt strategic conversations around the issues that actually matter. You can download your free copy at www.consultjuliette.com www.academyschools.co.uk/checklist. Okay, now let's continue with this week's episode. So I know that you're going to find this a fascinating conversation about partnerships between independent schools and state schools. So let's dive into my conversation with Graeme. So hello, Graeme, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast.
Hello, thanks for the invite.
It's great to have you here. So before we dive into partnerships in particular, and this is a subject that I know both of us are really passionate about, so we're going to have to be careful we keep to time on this one because there is so much for us to talk about. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, what's the root for your passion for education? What got you into being a teacher? And then also what led you from delivering in the classroom into a more partnerships role?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I grew up in a single parent family living on a council estate, relatively poor, not a huge amount of money, going to the local secondary school and not really having many opportunities. And so as I went through school and I was witnessing my friends, doing their music lessons and all those sort of things, I didn't have those opportunities. And so when it came time for me to go to university, obviously financing that was a problem. So I ended up working most of my way through university, and I managed to find myself landing in a private independent school. I ended up at Oakham School in the Midlands. And what I noticed fairly quickly was that the resources at Oakham weren't always used. And that sort of led me down the route of, thinking, well, actually, there's probably kids like me locally that don't have opportunity. And here are these amazing resources that are empty for a period of time. Why don't we bring those things together? So in answer to your question, I became a teacher because I wanted to provide opportunity to children like me. And I sort of leaned towards partnerships because I saw those resources sitting empty. And I was very aware that locally there'd be people who don't have those opportunities, and I wanted to make those things available to them.
Isn't it fascinating? I think so many people I speak to on the podcast, the reason they got into education was wanting to make a change, want to make a difference, and that teaching was something that interested them, and the combination of the two. But I love that in your story there, it's actually not just, a broad sense of education and then you find your place within the sector as your career develops, but actually there's a link right back in your own experience as a young person of education back to exactly what you're doing now with regards to partnerships work. That link is really close, isn't it?
It is. And also, I didn't go straight into teaching as a career. I did a computing degree first. I wanted to be a programmer. I wanted to do coding. And actually, I came out of that degree and there wasn't really any jobs in programming because everybody at that during that time was heading down that route. And so teaching was the next thing. And actually, when you look at the things that schools ask for the most, it's STEM or STEAM related activities. So moving into a role as head of design technology and then head of science, and my passion for that sort of public benefit piece and making opportunities available, they go hand in hand with STEM. Yeah,
absolutely.
And so everything's kind of led to this point.
Isn't that beautiful? I love the way life works out like that. And I think we'll come to this a little bit in our conversation, but because the needs within the state schools as a generality across the sector, there is a real need for expertise in science, technology, and particularly I know physics and computing are areas that are really kind of desperately in need of state school teachers. So when it comes to finding that mutual beneficial role, I can see that your background could be really important there. But before we dive into that detail, so I have been absolutely delighted to see the growing number of independent schools that are taking their state school partnership programs increasingly seriously. This is becoming not just this is something we would like to do, we'll have a teacher doing this a bit part-time on the side. This is becoming sort of an integral part of the role that independent schools can play in their communities. What do you think is changing in our society or in the independent school sector that's driving this sense of professionalism within the partnerships world?
I think, I've been doing this for many years, and I've been doing it since it wasn't a thing necessarily. Yeah. this whole kind of partnerships label, or what used to be outreach. It's I've watched it over the last sort of decade or so, as it's become what it is today. And I first started out, as I said, I was, head of design and technology. And we had those resources available, and there were schools close to us, especially primary schools, who don't have, workshops and kitchens and things like that, who showed an interest, and we used to just have them in. It wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a public benefit thing. It wasn't a charity thing. It was just us opening our facilities to local colleagues who wanted to bring their kids into our schools. And that progressed then to resources, because they didn't have microscopes, and we'd have kit because we were a secondary school. We'd have more things than them, and then it all came to a head for us with a science week that we ran, and we had loads of guest speakers and loads of fun things like robots and things, and a few local schools said, "Oh, that'd be really great, can we come?" And in that first year we had sort of 2,000 kids arrive, and the following year we did it more purposefully for them, and we had 4,000 kids arrive, and that very quickly, over a period of 3 or 4 years, became 15,000 children across a week. Wow. But that was back in a time when it was, we did it because it, we were passionate about it, and these facilities were available, and we couldn't see any reason why not. And we had great links with our colleagues locally, because that's what teachers do. More recently, it's become something where schools are actually taking on full-time members of staff, or more than one member of staff. There are schools taking on teachers who go into the local schools. There are schools who are dedicating whole classrooms to partnerships, which is a great thing. And I think it's because lots of people sort of organically did it, and it's sort of grown over time. And for me, after I did it for sort of 4 or 5 years, I was pulled in, and my head just said to me, look, why don't you just do this as a job? why don't you take 2 or 3 periods a week, and have a little bit of money to actually, make some time and make this happen and make it a more official thing. And the more we did it, the more time that was allocated to it, and the more time that was allocated to it, I think the more the schools, both schools, that sort of, the state schools and the independent schools, saw the value to both sides. So our students, from a service learning perspective, would be going into the local schools, and that was great for our kids. It was great for the local schools. We were able to call on their resources as well, because they'd have fantastic special needs teachers that we could call in for our bits and pieces. And so that mutuality just became a really valuable thing. And so I think it's grown organically into something which is really special.
And I love that idea that the more time you spend on it, the more value you see, both on both sides of the partnership, within the state schools and the independent schools. And I think for some schools who are only just starting, whenever you're starting something fairly new, it takes a lot of effort to do, just to get the ball rolling, basically. Yeah. And I think to know that further down this journey, please persist, please keep going. We know it, the first or second time you reach out to a school may not be, they may not want to work with you. That's fine. Keep trying, keep going. Because actually, the more time you do put into this, the more you see there is a momentum that builds within these partnerships, which I think is really important for people to know about when they're just starting out. The other thing that I think has really shifted is, as you mentioned, even the name of it, we used to talk about outreach, we now talk about partnerships, and it is that mutual beneficial partnership that's so important, isn't it? And people talk about this all the time, but there must be some key components to it being mutually beneficial. What have you learned along the way about if you're going to do this really well and make it a long-term mutually beneficial partnership? What are the key components that are needed, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting space, partnerships, because the reason the independent sectors become the independent sector schools become the hubs is because they can allocate resources to make that happen. So, at ACS International Schools, as an example, they've employed me full time. So full time, I'm working on partnerships. I have the time and the space to plan and strategize and have those Zoom calls and so on and so forth. Whereas the state schools that we work with, the primary schools, they haven't got somebody who's allocated to it. Their job is teaching and marking and doing all of the things that teachers do. And so there does become this sort of natural situation where the independent school takes a lead. And that's because they've got that resource. In actual fact, it's the relationships between the two that matter. And it's the private school obviously is making those leaps and making those connections. But actually, once you've made those connections, you're right, that mutuality is everything. And so I quite often say, I do more work through WhatsApp than I do through email. And that's because you make friends with people and you have colleagues in local schools who are teachers like you. It's not that we're taking a lead, and it's not the independent sector doing unto the state sector. It's just that the independent sector has the resources to start the conversation. That's the important thing.
I think that's right. I think the fact that it needs to end up being mutually beneficial, it still means that one partner or the other can take the lead in the early days. Exactly. And that's the goal you work for. And that over time it balances out to be mutually beneficial. But it may well be that as an independent school with a bit more time and resource, that actually it is down to you to make the first move, as it were, to build that relationship, that partnership.
And it does lean slightly in one direction, because we do have amazing resources in the independent sector. We do have theatres and swimming pools and all of those sort of things. But equally, we're a secondary school. And at ACS, as a perfect example, we're all through school from very young all the way up to sixth formers. And so we have these resources that local primary schools don't have. So they don't have science labs and they don't have swimming pools because they're a primary school. Yes. It's not because they're state sector and we're independent sector. It's just because we're a secondary school and they're a primary school. And that in itself, our resources are going to be better. And one thing I say to our partner schools is to think of our resources and our facilities as your resources and your facilities. So when people ring us up, it's not them asking if they can possibly use our facilities. It's, are they free?
Yeah.
And that's an important conversation to have, because if people in your partner schools are constantly ringing up and asking for favors, then you don't feel that mutuality.
Yeah.
It's always cap in hand.
Yeah.
And so that's an important conversation to have early on.
Definitely. And it goes hand in hand with that idea of relationships as well. If you've got a good working relationship, or even more than working, a good colleague friendship with the people that you're working with, as you say, these are teachers who have the same passion for education as we do in the independent sector. There's a lot of shared ground here. Exactly. Having those conversations early on about even just vocab and the words you use and so on. And I think sometimes there's some concern over almost like the etiquette or the manners that are involved in these partnerships as well. I think sometimes even starting these conversations can be a little bit awkward because of the history behind, the different ways that the sectors have been perceived and so on. Have you had any difficult situations that you've kind of learned over time about language that's particularly helpful, or kind of the etiquette, all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's all down to you and the way that you approach the situation. And it's, as you're right, there's certain vocabulary and there's certain language that if you use in the early days, people will take exception.
Yeah.
You are the private school behind the trees, and what do you want? And of course, a lot of schools, when you approach them with your charitable funds saying, well, we want to do this with you, but we'll cover the costs of refreshments and you can use our facilities for free. Your natural reaction is, what do you want? Because you don't get things free in life. And when you're a teacher, it's very rare that you get given things. Normally you have a limited budget and things are restricted. So to have somebody suddenly appear and go, yeah, of course you can use our facilities, and actually, we'll pay for your transport, and you do naturally sort of think, well, what do you want? Are you trying to steal our best kids? Or
exactly. And especially since we're trained in the world of kind of being aware of scammers and things like that. I'm not calling you a scammer, but we're trained in modern society to be a little bit skeptical of people that offer you something for free. So yeah, I can see that, absolutely.
Exactly. But the thing that always I always come back to is that yes, people are going to be defensive in the early days, and you have to get past that, and you have to gain that trust. And once you've gained that trust and you've made a friend and you are considered to be a colleague, then people do fire a WhatsApp go at you with oh my God, we're doing a nativity and we haven't got room for all the grandparents.
Yeah.
Any chance? But equally, it's important to understand that you're creating a network. So if a local school writes to me or rings me and says, look, we could do with a theatre, or we need somebody who's an expert in this, it might not be our resource. It might be the resource of another local independent school or another local state school, but we have the resource and the capacity to coordinate.
Yeah.
And so it's not just people asking us if they can use our facilities. It's people ringing us and us saying, well, actually, I had a conversation with another school yesterday that's also got a theatre. Or I know a chap who works at a local school that's great with iPads.
Yeah. Let me give him a call for you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think as well that there's a parallel that kind of comes into my mind, which is the way that certainly when I started wanting to talk more publicly about things like social justice, inequality, racial inequality, and so on, the thing that held me back was not knowing what the right language to use was. And I think what I've learned along the way as I've started to become a bit more confident talking publicly about some of those topics is if you simultaneously share your passion for where you want the world to end up and what you believe, your vision for what the world should be like in a really honest way, and simultaneously say, I might get it wrong sometimes. This is a transparency and honesty to this conversation. And as we build respect for each other and knowledge of each other as we develop a partnership, I'm going to need you to tell me when I get it wrong, because that's what I need to learn. And I think all of us maybe can take that attitude, that approach to these partnerships that we're forging as well. So you have to make the first move. You have to get over those first few kind of partnership activities that you're working on together. But then at some point, one of the conversations is, look, we've got to be really honest with each other. If I say something, I'm using the wrong language privately, not in front of lots of people, but can you let me know? Because I need to understand how this is affecting people.
Exactly. We had quite a few years ago now, I developed this program called Outreach Boxes. And these boxes basically have equipment in them that we loan to schools and we use in our schools as well. So it's expensive kit that, it's a good idea to buy once than buy 30 times and share. But I called them Outreach Boxes because back in the day, I was director of outreach, and outreach is what we called it. And then there was a huge conversation around, well, should we be using the term outreach now? And I contacted a few of our local state primary schools and asked them what they thought. And they basically said, we don't care. At the end of the day, we know you. We know you're doing things for the right reasons. The kit that arrives is amazing. You come along, you have a coffee, you talk to us, and we put the world to rights. And if there's any opportunities for collaboration, we make it happen. Who cares what it's called? But you're right. When we do a presentation or a podcast or anything like this, you have to use the right language because people who don't know you can take exception quite quickly. And what I've learned is that, the use of the term outreach or public benefit or partnerships, you have to be very careful with people who focus on words.
Yes.
So when you go to a large event, if I say outreach, I can literally hear people gasp in the background.
Yeah.
But actually, once people get to know you, they know that you mean well, and that the work that you do is in the interests of enhancing the education of children at both schools. Yeah,
absolutely. So getting that purpose across to people, and then asking for the feedback and the honesty. I think that's the way that I think you have to go with. You have to have some humility in this, so sort of as you go through these relationships that you're building.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see it as relationships. I see it as friendships. These are colleagues of mine who've done the same degree that I've done, that have just ended up in a different school that has different resources. Yeah. And so, we do everything we can for me to use their resources and for them to use my resources. And as I say, social media is better than any other form of communication, because you do get those conversations just with how about, what if, do you know, and they're the most important conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it human, doesn't it, using WhatsApp rather than a formal dear sir type email.
Exactly.
So you and I first met at the bursaries conference in March 2022.
Yes.
And I was absolutely blown away by the content that you were sharing in your session around the way that you're using at ACS, using data and systems to build efficiency, but also to involve people and involve staff. I would love if you could share with us a little bit more about the systems that you've created for ACS International Schools. I know you have 4 schools, and it'd be interesting to know whether you're using the same systems in all 4 schools. So tell us a little bit more about how the practicalities work at ACS of partnerships.
Yeah, of course. It's always been a thing since I started out on this many years ago. The word impact always comes into conversations, especially when you're talking about budget or staffing. But it's being able to hold yourself accountable for what you do. And also having something where you can look at trends in data to evaluate and improve what you do. And so when I say, being held accountable, there are lots of different stakeholders in partnerships. So, you have your CEOs or your headmasters, and you have your boards or trustees or governors. You have somebody who's in charge of finance that's, giving you a budget each year. And you have to kind of almost justify what you're doing to a certain extent. And in the past, it's been very much, writing of case studies. It's very easy to have sort of qualitative data rather than quantitative data, because when you run an event, a school will put it in their newsletter, or you'll get an email, or you can have a questionnaire or a survey or something like that, and you get lots of really lovely content. But actually having data is incredibly useful. So how many staff hours are we putting into something? How many kids attend? How many staff attend? How much does it cost us? All of those sort of questions. Which key stage, which elements of the national curriculum are you covering? Really important, because you can very easily in partnerships sort of follow one trend, because it's very easy, for example, to work with primary schools. It's not so easy to work with secondary schools. It's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that a very simple event that you host is only going to cost £500. But actually, when you consider how many staff hours you're putting into it, and when you consider the catering, and when you consider the venue, and when you consider everything, actually that very simple event costs more like £3,000. And so what's very common in partnerships is your partnership managers who don't have a huge budget, they pretend that something's going to be cheaper than it is, so that they'll be allowed to do it.
Let's be honest, we've all been there. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so when new people are starting in partnerships and their senior management are saying to them, well, how much, what sort of budget do you need? It's a lot easier to say, well, I need this, and go for a lower number in the hope that you'll get some money, than actually putting a higher number forwards, which is more realistic. And then what you end up with as a partnerships manager or director is getting further down the line with the budget you've been given and realizing that it's not enough.
Absolutely.
and so having data where you can turn around to board members and say, right, we've done 30,000 hours of community service this month, or being able to turn around and say, well, for every pound that we spend, we are accomplishing the following, or being able to say, in the last 6 months, these are the age groups we've covered, and you can see how much we've done with key stage 1, 2, 3, and so on. That's really useful for all those different reasons, for applying for new budgets each year, for achieving your staffing, for putting things out into the big wide world, telling parents of the private school what you're doing and why you're doing it and why we're a charity. It makes life a lot easier. And you can also, on the system that we've built, you can hit a button and it will print off a sort of an impact report for you for different stakeholders. So it saves you a lot of work too.
Which is always good to know. Yeah.
Exactly. But for me, it's being able to spot trends in data. So when I go out and I speak to head teachers and we have a conversation about, what opportunities are out there, being able to see that there are 6 schools that have the same opportunities, or being able to see that there are similar areas of the curriculum that people are struggling with, enables me to then say, right, our next event is.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful.
And you're evidencing the need as well as the impact in that sense, aren't you?
Exactly. I mean, it's really interesting because impact is sort of long term. You know, it's what we achieve over time. Whereas, you know, if we run an event, the end of that event is the outcome. And I think people get very confused between impact and outcome.
Yes.
You know, outcome is at the end of each thing you do, and all of those different bits of data from those outcomes go into the overall impact. And so the algorithm is really important. That said, you will never get it right. And there's hundreds of people out there trying to work out what the algorithm for impact is. But in actual fact, there is no algorithm for impact because it's impossible to define. But the fact that you're doing it, the fact that you're going through the process and that you are holding yourself accountable and you are using data to improve means everything. And I use that example of risk assessments. You know, a risk assessment, it's not about the piece of paper, it's the process you go through.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it's the same with impact.
Completely. And the thing that comes to mind actually for me is within the wider not-for-profit sector, we see a lot of charities choosing to, but also having to, because their funders require it increasingly, have what's called a theory of change. And when you have a theory of change sort of flow chart, it takes you all the way through the process of understanding the inputs of what you have as a charity, the activities that you're going to undertake with those inputs, and the outcomes that are going to happen, or sometimes called the outputs and then separately the outcomes.
Yeah.
But then after that, often on the far right-hand side of the flow chart, you have the impact. And actually what funders care about, generally speaking, is seeing a long-term impact that they, as a funding body, are engaged in or are caring about. They don't actually normally care that much exactly what activity you do or exactly what your outcomes are, as long as you can demonstrate that it's creating the impact that they care about. And the challenge that a lot of not-for-profits have is that impact is normally quite long-term and very hard to track and measure, and can be a little bit ephemeral. It's quite hard to kind of really pin it down. But I think exactly as you say, even I've worked with some not-for-profits on a theory of change for them, and even though the end result is useful from a funding applications point of view, from a staff communications point of view, the biggest benefit comes from actually creating it in the first place, and the conversations that have to happen to actually understand what your outcomes are and what your impact is. And then, of course, the ideal is you work back from your impact to design your activities in terms of what you're actually going to be focusing on. So a lot of parallels here to the not-for-profit sector, the wider not-for-profit sector.
It's interesting. I mean, our impact started when I first started at ACS. So our process started with me looking at the area that we're in, drawing a 5-mile radius around each one of our campuses and reading every single Ofsted report for every school in the area, which took me about 2 or 3 months. And what you very quickly realize when you're going through that process and you're cutting up those Ofsted reports into data, and you're saying, well, this school has said that they need to work more with data. This school has said they need to do more STEM. This school has said, you very quickly understand that actually out of the 200 schools, there's 50 that have that, and there's 10 that have that, and so on and so forth. And so that led us to our 3 pillars of partnership, which is community collaboration, bringing schools together for that, to build that network so that everybody's working as one. Our second pillar is digital innovation, because that was something that all schools, nearly every school wanted to do more with. So, access to hardware, software, expertise. And then our third one was, and this caused me a little bit of pain because I started off with teacher excellence, but the word excellence people didn't like. So it was teacher training, giving teachers the ability to enhance their craft, because a lot of the teacher training that's out there is about, how you conform to the national curriculum or how you do health and safety or, the essential things, but it's not on the content. So if you're a maths teacher, it's very rare to go to teacher training on maths. Or if you're a science teacher, it's very rare to go on training for new scientific concepts. You go on training on how to teach the IB and how to fill in this form and so on. But it's very rare where you go to training where you become a better teacher.
Which can also connect you through to that passion again.
Exactly.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. But that's where we started. So we went through the investigation, the research. We then wrote our strategy, which has those 3 pillars. And then we have our impact and our sort of KPIs, if you like, for the 5 years are to reach 1 million hours of interaction with local children, 30,000 hours of teacher training, and 100,000 regular users of our digital assets. And so that very clearly then enables us to strategize as to the direction we go in with regards to our partnerships program, and very easily enables us to evaluate the work that we do against all of that work that's come previously. So it's not just a case of running events and seeing how good they are. It's running events and, looking at them through that window of, or what did we say was needed?
I love what you've just shared with us, because it harks back as well to that idea of being really strategic in what you're doing. No school, however well funded, is going to be able to do everything that it wants to do in the partnerships realm. Yeah. So it has to be about selecting where you're going to focus your efforts. And I think what you've given us there, a kind of a rundown of those 3 pillars that you have, is really important. That other schools won't have the same 3 pillars, but the concept that you need to focus in, it may just be one thing to start with. It might not be 3, it might be one thing, but you need to have a focus, and then there needs to be a rationale for that focus. And it has to be thinking about strategy and how we best develop and implement strategy. The rationale behind what you choose to focus on has to be a combination of where you as an independent school have resource. So that might be pockets of excellence, it might be physical resource, whatever it might be, facilities and so on. How can you map that onto need? And I love as well that even though it takes a long time to read those Ofsted reports, it's probably quicker doing it that way than actually having in-depth interviews with every single one of those heads. So in a way, you're shortcutting a process of getting to know those schools by using Ofsted as at least a first pass, an indicator of which schools may offer the match between what you as a school can offer, where you have resource, where you have pockets of excellence, with what those schools need. And I think that actually that outlines a really nice strategic process that you could see, sort of a step-by-step process that any school could go through if they're looking to either start or grow more strategically their programme.
I think so. And I should add that after reading all the Ofsted reports, we did go into schools.
Yes, of course. That has to be the next step.
Yeah,
yes.
So the next step was exactly that. It was going in to speak to the head teachers and have those conversations. And we also spent quite a lot of time going through data. I mean, data is my thing, as you've probably gathered. But I spent a long time going through indexes for deprivation and looking at data. And what you very quickly realize is that a lot of the data is pretty old. And by the time you've got hold of the data, it's out of date. And so being able to do your sort of own primary research and reading up-to-date Ofsted reports and going in and speaking to the head teachers and the teachers and speaking to the councils and so on and so forth, you frame the picture and you have an understanding, and you understand actually, how many mats there are in the area, how many small primary schools are there in the area, how many church schools are there, how many, and so on. Yeah. And so before you go out and meet with those teachers, you have to have a good understanding of what's in the area. And also for independent school teachers who are taking on a role like that, understanding the state sector.
Yes, critically important. Yeah,
exactly, because they do things in a different way than we do.
And it changes. So even if you've had state school experience at some point previously on your CV, it may have shifted since then. And we're seeing, especially with the government's kind of policy direction heading toward multi-academy trusts more and more, I think we are seeing constant shifts and change in the state sector. Yeah. So it's important to be up to date, I think, as well.
It is. And when you go out, we ran an event for 23 schools last week. And it was an early years session. And one of the biggest questions that day was, what are we doing next? From a primary school's perspective, a small primary school, they've read the white paper and it's like, well, what do we do now?
Yeah.
And there's a level of fear.
Yeah.
There's a level of misunderstanding, because actually, if you read through that white paper, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
A lot of questions that come off the back of it. But again, being able to sort of sit with people and going, actually, do you know what? I've read the white paper, I've read the green paper, I've read the leveling up documentation, and know what they're talking about, and know what they're going through that we in the independent sector necessarily don't have to go through. Conforming to the national curriculum and so on and so forth. That's really important. And so there's a lot of work to be done to be a really good partnerships manager, director, whatever the title is that you've been given. And quite often schools will think, do you know what, that's a really good thing to do. We're going to have a partnerships team. And they'll allocate somebody 2 periods a week and give them £5,000. That's particularly dangerous, because then you end up in a scenario where people assume what collaboration should look like rather than actually investigate and do the research. And that's where you don't end up with those relationships, because you're turning up offering things which people don't need.
Absolutely. And I think in a way, if you're going to allocate only a small amount of budget as an independent school into this, those networks become even more important, don't they? So the networks with other independent schools in your area who are also all allocating, maybe all of them quite small budgets, but pooling your knowledge, pooling your impact and understanding where as a group of schools, where do we need to act? And I know that in some parts of the country that's easier than others, largely due to the competitive nature of the admissions picture. Yeah. But this isn't about admissions. And just as the fundraisers find it very easy to collaborate between schools, I'm hoping that the same is true of partnerships, because the level of competitiveness isn't in this element of independent school.
It's an interesting one of my most used phrases is, we believe in collaboration, not competition.
Yeah.
And what's lovely for me as a partnerships director is that I don't get too involved in fundraising and enrollment and marketing and things like that. So I don't feel the need to get too involved in those areas, and so I can be sort of unbiased and impartial to a certain extent.
Exactly. Normally the fundraisers find the same, because they are fundraising from a community that is normally unique to their school, or at least largely unique to their school. So there's very little overlap between other local independent schools. I think it's the marketers and the admissions teams find it much more difficult. And of course, we always have to keep in mind, markets and competitions regulation when we're talking about collaboration between schools as well. But generally speaking, if a school is putting in a pretty small amount of budget and time, it's better than nothing. But to avoid those dangers that you just referenced there, kind of getting into the network of other schools that are doing the same thing must be important.
It's sometimes a misunderstanding as to what partnerships is. And I spend a lot of time going into schools who are interested in getting into this space and just want to know more. Or I have people who've been put in that role who then come and see me for an afternoon to talk about what partnerships is. And the first question that I'm always asked is, well, how much budget do we allocate to this?
Yes.
And that's not the first question you should be asking. The first question you should be asking is, why are you doing partnerships? You're doing it to enhance the education of all children in your region. That's it. It's not for any other reason. It's not for marketing. It's not for PR. It's not to find amazing children to give them scholarships. It's not that. And it's a very separate entity. However, that said, when you do amazing partnerships work, the schools you're working with will put you in their newsletters, or they'll advertise for you. And there's no better advertising for an independent school than somebody else talking about how amazing you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there are those benefits that come off the back of doing amazing partnership work, but you don't do it for those benefits.
Yeah, I agree. There's one area where I'm very conscious of time. I knew this conversation would be hard to keep to time, but there's one area that I just want to drill down into there. So you absolutely correctly, from my perspective, mentioned that this isn't about anything to do with marketing. It isn't about scholarship recruitment. Is there, however, some acceptable overlap in some partnerships, definitely not all, with regards to bursary provision, in the sense that these are transformational bursaries, fully means tested, opportunities potentially with primary schools. But there's difficult ground here, isn't there, to navigate?
There is, but again, it comes down to relationships, and I'll give you a perfect example that came up recently. We have a partnership with Surrey Young Carers, and our partnerships are not just with schools; they're with industry and charities, and anybody that can enhance the education of children. So we've got a huge number of children locally that are young carers, and we invite them into our facilities to use our pools, use our theatres, use everything that we've got free of charge. One of the girls that comes to that, and has come to 3 or 4 events, just lingered at the end of one of our events recently. And she wanted to talk to me, but she wanted to wait until everybody else had gone. And everybody else disappeared. And then she came up with her mum and told me how thrilled she was that she's now got a bursary to ACS, and she starts in September.
Superb.
And this all came from, we were running a photography challenge, and we had a fashion photographer in that was doing a session for the Surrey Young Carers. And I found myself sat in a little hut in the middle of a forest with some of the helpers and loads of kids talking about private schools and what were they, and do kids actually sleep here, and that sort of stuff. And I was just telling them all about private schools and independent schools and who we were, and everything about who we were. And this girl, obviously, it clicked, and she went home, told her mum, and then the mum said to me, do you know what? I'm unemployed. I've got a disabled daughter who all our attention goes on, and I'm so thrilled that we're able to give this opportunity to this other daughter.
Yes.
And that's really powerful. Those things coming from the things you do, and equally, having that relationship with local head teachers of the primary schools who can ring you up and say, do you know what? I've got this amazing kid who will, huge potential and would really flourish in your environment. That to me is the best way of achieving bursaries. Yeah. Because a head teacher of a local primary school knows their kids so well. Yeah. And when you've got that relationship and you've got that trust and you know that head teacher so well, they will ring you up and say, here's a person, would you mind if I put the family in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. And that all comes back, and I want to echo back that word that you used earlier about friendships. It's about having not just relationships with these schools, but friendships with these key people that can understand your school, so they know what type of children would thrive in that environment, and they are on the lookout for pupils of their own who then can benefit from those advantages.
Exactly. It all comes down to us. Doesn't matter which school we work in, we're all colleagues working together with the same focus, which is the enhancement of the education of all children. It doesn't matter which school that child is in, all of us across the schools are focused on those children achieving their best potential.
Exactly.
And that's what it should and always should come down to.
That seems like the obvious moment to end our conversation. I'm so delighted that we've had this opportunity to dive into these topics in more detail. And for me, this is why I do the work that I do. Like, I'll be completely honest, and I've said this before, I wouldn't work with independent schools unless there was this kind of ethical, moral drive within the sector to be doing the right thing for our communities, for our society. And so it fills my heart with joy to hear about schools that are doing it so well, just as ACS International Schools. So thank you, Graeme, for your time today. It's been a delight.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.